Thank you very much that you have come today. So yesterday we had the presentation of Christine Mennesson about gender classes and some sport practices of children. And today Lucie Forté will present you the works of Bernard Lahire. We have discussed yesterday about Lahire, which is French sociologist, which is very well known in France, but he's not known abroad. I think that the main problem is that he published mainly in French, so it's the problem, and we don't have translation. But he worked on Bourdieu'a concept, so Lucie will present us. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, here you can taste some sweets from Toulouse, so please feel free to taste them.
Okay, so thanks a lot, Honorata, for your invitation, and thanks to your laboratory of your institute. It is really a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to talk about the way a certain number of research deal with the habitus theory in order to enlighten for our laboratory sport practices in general and high-level sportive career in particular, which is my main topic. In this presentation I am going to make 2 points. I will first focus on some major concepts of the habitus theory of Pierre Bourdieu, and I will expose the conceptual tools that we can use in order to study what we could call the effects of institutions on individual trajectories. This first point will give me the opportunity to present the work of Bernard Lahire, who extended the scope of the concept of habitus, field and practices to more diversified societies, which are more at the image of our actual society. So my presentation will report an article that I highly recommend if you want to discover Lahire in English. It's not an article from Bernard Lahire, but it's an article from French people working on conceptions, so it might be interesting for your group, the yesterday presentation we heard. So it's an article made by French researchers on consumptions, but in English, so you have the opportunity to read it. I think it's easily available on the internet. Yeah. But I can send it.
We all know this page that I have sent it.
Yeah. But if you don't manage to get it, I will send it. And then I will more shortly present one of my contributions to the comprehension of sportive career, a contribution which is going to use some of the conceptual tools I will have talked about before. And therefore, I will present high-level sportive career as careers which lean on a strong feeling that sport is a vocation. I will use the socialization theories in order to enlighten the social processes which are involved in the construction of such a feeling and more broadly in the construction of a performance body. So to start with the first point, as you might know, Pierre Bourdieu's theory offers some tools in order to apprehend the question of the social determinism on practices, and he questions the effects of class and gender. So in his book, The Distinction, he considers that habitus and capital plus field give practices. So habitus is one of the main concepts of the work of Bourdieu, and it can be defined as a system of durable and transposable disposition and it is the results of agents' incorporation of their experiences in the form of inclinations, tendencies, or propensities to believe, to judge, to feel, and or to act in a certain way. More specifically, Bourdieu wrote that these dispositions come together as a driving principle of relatively homogeneous and durable practices and representations. So these characteristics, the homogeneity and the durability, derive from the mode of socializations of agents, according to Bourdieu. According to him, what he calls the primary socialization is the predominant form, and it is the principal framework for the acquisition of the cultural elements to which agents belong. So the habitus works usually on an unconscious level by familiarization within an imposed family structure and also by the implication at school. And according to Bourdieu, the lack of competition from other socializing influences during childhood, together with the fact that the primary socialization is very long and marked by a high number of repetitions, produce a relatively stable and homogeneous product, according to Bourdieu. So this is the first concept of Bourdieu I wanted to talk about, and then he also talks about the field. According to him, we must not confuse habitus with class habitus. What he says, what Bourdieu says, is that it is true that the material conditions for the existence of agents and their place in the social space play an important role in the construction of their tastes, of their practices, but Bourdieu insists that the expression of habitus can only be understood at a single and relevant level of analysis, which is the field. So fields are microcosm that form the macrocosm of social space. They are relatively autonomous and they have their own specific logic. Their rules of play and specific objective cannot be reduced to purely economic interests. Fields, we can say also that there is therefore an habitus for each field, and only, according to Bourdieu, only those agents who possess this habitus are allowed to play in the field. He also says that although each field is a place for struggle, it is in the interest of all agents who occupy it that it should continue to exist in order to maintain the value of their capital. And Bourdieu also says that the field space is structured by different positions of the agents within the field. One of Bourdieu's major contribution is to define these positions in terms of the structure and the nature of the capital which is held by people. So this includes the economic capital, revenue and patrimony, the cultural capital in different definition of cultural capital, in its institutionalized form, which are titles and diplomas, but also in its objectivated form, which are, for example, the possession of cultural objects. And also the cultural capital has another form, which is the incorporated form, such as knowledge or know-how, education, and so on. He also talks about the social capital. We could discuss about the definition he gave, he says that it is the resources linked to the durable network of relations. And he also talks about symbolic capital, which he defines as all forms of capital specifically recognized within a given field. So these forms of capital are at play and are expressed in practices in the field in which they are valued in a specific way. So, as I said before, practices can be considered as the encounter between habitus and field. And indeed, shared tastes and practices are socially constructed in the case of agents who share the same position in a given field. They reveal relatively coherent and homogeneous lifestyles at a collective level, but also at an individual level. And in this regard, according to Bourdieu'a, tastes are always categorized socially. For example, they are considered as more or less legitimate. And at the same time, tastes categorize agents by associating them with a particular social group and a particular position in the social space. In his book, The Distinction, he describes three driving principles of tastes. What he calls the choice of necessity, associated with the working class, what he calls the pretension of the good cultural will, which is associated with the petite bourgeoisie, and what he calls the good taste of the elite. In the late 90s, the capacity of Bourdieu's concept to analyze social practices in an increasingly fragmented work was a subject of lots of debates. Certain sociologists observed that our society were becoming more and more shifted and concluded that social determinism was becoming weakened. Bernard Lahire, a French sociologist, didn't adopt this position and proposed an original reading of Bourdieu. Lahire based his sociological analysis on an individual scale by focusing his study on the individual, which he considered as multi-determinated and therefore as pluralist. So in his research, what stands out is his kind of unique sociological approach, which is to observe behaviors and representations on an individual scale. His approach allows him to explain intra-individual variations in taste or practices and their possible dissonance, whereas macro-social perspective, in contrast, squeeze out such individual observations. So what we can say is that Lahire opposes Durkheim's reading of the social, which he says tends to leave inter- and intra-individual observation for the psychologist and objectivate social forms like institution, for example, without questioning their real use. How do individuals use those institutions? So he prefers to see individuals as multi-determinated social actors in a society that has become highly diversified. This perspective involves rereading the traditional notions of habitus, field, practice, and socialization. He proposes a comprehensive framework which he describes as dispositionalist and contextualist. Therefore, his framework seems more suitable to less homogeneous social contexts. This perspective adopted by Lahire is based on the observation that the practices, the behaviors, and the representations of individuals are usually dissonant. He developed this idea in a book only in French, sorry, which is called La culture des individus, the culture of individuals, where he analyzes the profile of actors combining legitimate cultural consumption, such as opera, fine literature, art house cinema, but who combine those kind of cultural consumption with mass cultural consumptions, such as musical, cookery, gardening books, mainstream film, and so on. So his work leads to a discussion of the current validity of the model of distinction, which has been much criticized because of the observation that the upper classes have highly heterogeneous cultural practices, referred to as omnivorous instead of univorous, that is finally dissonant with the theory of Bourdieu. So, based on these observations, Bernard Lahire reformulated Bourdieu's concept on an individual scale, and his research focuses on linking the individual variability of practices and representations to the existence of heterogeneous patrimonies of dispositions, rather than, as you can understand, to relatively homogeneous class habitus. So while maintaining Bourdieu's dispositional approach, he operates a distinction between dispositions and competencies, which are defined here as knowledge and know-how, that is only realized in a specific context. And he also operates a distinction between dispositions and appetencies, which are defined as more simply as the taste or the distaste for a given practice. But more than on the definition of dispositions, Lahire opposes Bourdieu on the conditions of their formation. Lahire tells us that dispositions are formed over the course of several socialization experiences due to a highly diversified society and to the fact that individuals are living in a system of educational competition. He shows that the effects of socialization cannot be reduced to the results of the primary socialization, and he accounts for horizontal socialization between peers or between spouses, as well as what he calls inverted socialization from children to parents. So, seen from this perspective, dispositions can be acquired at different stages in life, and above all, can be opposed to one another as much as the location in which they are acquired. For example, there can be an opposition between the family and the professional sphere, and those contexts construct dispositions which can be dissonant. So, according to him, it is therefore important to explain why one disposition may be expressed more than another in a particular context. That is to say, why are some dispositions more transposable and more durable than others. So, Lahire, as you can understand, Lahire prefers talking about socialization in context rather than socialization in field, because according to him, the field is only one particular level of analysis relating to the social world. He has two arguments to say that. First of all, he says he doesn't want to focus only on the field because, according to him, Bourdieu's field excludes from his analysis what he calls the outfield practices of the agents in a given field, and which are those that happened before the agent's entry into the field, or the practices which are parallel to his life in the field. So this is the first argument about this question of outfield practices. But secondly, he doesn't want only to focus on the field because, according to him, Bourdieu's field excludes also the practices of individuals who do not possess the codes of the field, but who can nonetheless confront to the field. So he pays a particular attention to the way in which dispositions are interiorized in terms of precociousness, repetition, and duration of socializing experiences and context, which is the word he uses more than field. These different mechanisms of interiorization can have different consequences for the strength, for the stability, and for the transferability of dispositions in competitions with one another. It's important to have this idea that disposition we construct, individual construct, are always in competitions with other dispositions. So this perspective involves retracing trajectories of individuals in a chronological manner, and also retracing the interaction between the different contexts in which individuals live or have lived in the past. So it is necessary, according to him, to specify what these contexts are and the impact they have on the actors concerned. It is also necessary, according to him, to categorize the relationships between these contexts. Some carry more weight than others when it comes to learning, and some have more legitimate effects than others. So social practices in his work are studied as the product of the encounter between disposition in context. For him, contexts are the locus in which dispositions are constructed, but contexts are also the locus in which dispositions are put on standby or activated or placed in a state of tension. Here too, Lahire's approach is different to Bourdieu's approach because while he also recognizes the transposability of general disposition, on an individual scale, he observed that dispositions are expressed with more or less difficulty in a way that is more or less extensive, depending on the domain. For example, school, family, leisure, work, and so on. So, according to him, the expression of these dispositions depends on the confrontation between what he calls internal and external relations of force. So as you can see, the first specific feather of Lahire's approach resides in the individual level of his sociological analysis. He focuses on the inter and the intra-individual variability of behaviors and representations, whereas sociologists often limit their analysis to the microsocial and the microsocial and macrosocial levels. So he regularly reminds us in his different books that it would be a mistake to read his work as a demonstration of the advent of an autonomous actor free of all social determinists. It is really not his point of view. He refutes both the rise of individualism and the social psychologism or atomism that may be linked to it, because for him, and that's the reason why he's really in the continuity of Bourdieu, the individual, the internal conscience or subjectivity, as the locus of our ultimate freedom. Freedom is one of the major contemporary myths. The actor he identifies as pluralist, since he is multi-determinated, is in fact someone who is permanently socialized. So his approach requires a significant adaptation of some of the traditional methods used in sociology. For example, in a book called Portrait Sociological Portraits, he describes his test protocol for the notion of dispositions, competencies, appetencies, and transferability. And he explained that data collection was based on 8 individual portraits made from a series of 6 very, very long interviews focused on various domains: school, work, family, sociability, leisure, and cultural practices, but also body, health, food, beauty, and so on. Because the analysis he carried out assumes the need to go beyond the primary speech of actors, using a systematic comparison between profile based on socialization modes with varying levels of difference and between domains of practices or intra-domains situation. So the analysis of moments of tensions in the individual trajectories is essential to his work. Such crises are said to reflect the maladjustment between dispositions and context. Lahire thereby proposes a perspective in which actors are neither the cultural idiots, often criticized under Bourdieu's approach, but they are nor intellectuals capable of consciously controlling their relationship with the world. The second specific failure of his approach lies in its pluralist and comprehensive position. Lahire proposes a combination of 2 programs, often presented as being opposed. And this integrational approach is intended as an answer to the social differentiation that characterize pluralist individual, as much as it studies the academic construct that accounts for the social. So his analysis leads him to consider a wide range of contexts useful in social sciences, classes, domains of practices, words, fields, institutions, or microgroups are all useful, according to him, depending on the choice of the observational scale and depending on the knowledge issue targets by the researcher. So, to conclude this first point, Lahire's sociological analysis presuppose contexts that interact, and his use of an individual scale invites to study the combination of dispositions which are interiorized in different socialization contexts based on social category, such as class, age, gender, and so on, but also based on a broader social and historical situation. So he's in constant dialogue with Bourdieu, but he extends the scope of the concept of habitus, field, and practices to more diversified societies. So in this regard, his work offers conceptual tools which permit to take account of the social determinism on an individual scale, to take account of the acquisition of competencies and appetencies in different social contexts, as well as their transfer from one context to another, He also permits to take account of the dissonance that arise between practices and consumption context on an individual scale. And he also permits to take account of the conditions and the consequences of the encounter between different styles within a single practice. So maybe it could be interesting also for what you talked about yesterday with your students. I am now going to switch on the second part of my communication, basing my analysis on the methodological tools and theoretical tools promoted by Bernard Lahire. I want to talk about the social processes which are involved in the development of high-level sportive careers and the construction of a performant body. So, first of all, I would like to say that the access to a high-level sportive career is marked by a succession of moments of detection, selections, consecrations, in a local, then a national, and an international level. And those moments are orchestrated by the sportive institutions, but are also relayed, or not. And I would even say, for the progression in the sportive career, have to be relayed by other spheres of socialization, such as family, peers, school. And those different moments of detection, selection, and consecration finally invite to a gradual entrance in a world apart, which promotes the embodiment of a high-level athlete habitus, and which is the place of the inculcation of the feeling that sport is a vocation, that in a certain way I was made for that, would say the athletes. Two levers play a main role in this collective enterprise, which is orchestrated by the sportive institution, and by a sportive institution which looks like a total institution in Goffman's sense. And as I said before, this enterprise is also relayed by other spheres of socialization. But I want to focus on the two levers which play a main role in this collective enterprise. The first lever refers to an enterprise of revelation, which can be compared to a calling for athletics. This calling nurtures the feeling of being elected into an elite group thanks to some kind of gift made of natural quality, something kind of extraordinary, and that is very uncommon. The second lever leans on the development of a passionate and enchanted vision of the sportive career, which is presented and also experienced by the young sportsmen and sportswomen as a second nature, and a way to stand out, to distinguish oneself, and to satisfy the expectation of sportive and extra-sportive environments. But the strength of this enterprise of socialization, which leads to the inculcation of the feeling that sport is a vocation, the strength of this enterprise of socialization must not overshadow the fact that this feeling can be witnessed. In effect, at each stage of the sportive career, the socialization processes can be more or less congruent and may allow the consolidation or the transformation of the face in a sportive destiny. So, in this perspective, my communication will consider the hardship of injury as an event and a socialization framework which is likely to generate a crisis of the feeling that sport is a vocation. My presentation is based on data that I collected during a wider research, my PhD research, which was dedicated to the question of the social production of a sportive excellence in track and field, in athletics. And in order to identify the key factors and the context of the work of inculcation of a feeling that sport is a vocation, 32 biographic interviews were conducted with top-level athletes or ex-top-level athletes. And I also made an ethnographic study that I still follow, so now I can say it's an ethnography study of 10 years. And the aim of my qualitative perspective was to break open what Lahire calls the black box of socialization, in order to enlighten the different components of socialization, its functioning modalities and its effects. So in this communication, I will focus our attention on a particular moment of the sportive career, the hardship of injury and recovery. And I will more specifically talk about the socialization processes which can come into play during this moment of injury, medical care, recovery, rehabilitation, and reathletization. So my aim is to analyze the effects of injury, and you can understand of its socialization context, on athletes' dispositions, and more specifically on the upholding of their feeling that sport is their vocation in this moment of crisis. Therefore, I will analyze the effects of injuries on the symbolic marking process, which goes hand in hand with the education of the feeling that sport is a vocation. My analysis will focus on interviews and observations that were led with French-level top athletes who had gone through, who were going through an important injury, and who were residents of the National Institute for Sport, Expertise and Performance, which is the main national training center for athletics in France, and which looks like, as I said before, a total institution which has some similarities with the total institutions. As in reference to Goffman, we can say that it constitutes a place of work and residence where a great number of similarly situated people cut off from the wider community for a considerable time together lead an enclosed and formally administrated round of life. So in case of injury, the first thing I would like to say is that the bodily damage is likely to affect negatively the election feeling for two reasons. First, as underlined by this top-level athlete, injury can destabilize the predestination feeling which has been fed during the prime inculcation of the feeling that sport is a vocation. Even though the vertical jump property results from the combination of physical and technical quality, which are notably acquired by training, the fact of being recognized in the field of athletics as having some feet, as says this athlete, it's an idiom that I cannot translate because I even talked about with American people, English people, they don't, in athletics, they don't use this expression. It's really a French expression, having some feet, which means that you are very performant in jumping, but it is a quality you also need in sprint and other disciplines of athletics. So the fact of being recognized in the field of athletics as having some feet constitutes an element of symbolic marking which lays on the naturalization of sports skills. It seems like it's a natural quality, something that you have or that you don't have. And this operation of symbolic marking is very powerful for the development of this predestination feeling. And consequently, the symbolic marking process is called into question when the physical integrity is damaged by an injury. The belief in a presumed superiority related to the possession of a kind of gift can be highly disrupted, particularly in case of injuries which need a surgery. Furthermore, injury can provoke a more or less durable stagnation and even regression of sportive performances, and some athletes spoke about a dicing fall, real or symbolic, in the sportive hierarchy, saying, I didn't have the same aura, my progression curve stopped all at once, I felt I was set aside. And in this context, as you can read on the slide, the doubts which are generated are likely to destabilize the face of having the capacity to achieve the sports vocation. The case of Serge illustrates this process after 3 years of invincibility in the National Youth Championship and the National Under-20 Championship. He faced a chain of injuries during 2 years. And when I met him, it had been 3 years since he didn't improve his personal best performance. And the way he talked about his first injury that he considered as a founding event with his before and its after tells a lot about the decline of his election feeling. The relegations experience, which settled down during several athletic seasons, casted doubts in the face he had that sports was his vocation. Feeling weakened, searched for the sign of his own recognition in the reflection of others in order to reassure himself. But during those difficult times, it didn't work out because his family didn't really care about his involvement in athletics, so his family wasn't a resource. And at the same time, his training partner had a spectacular progression, so that Serge progressively became a kind of sparring partner in the group in which he initially held a dominant position. Moreover, the weak interest manifested by his coach also contributed to his vocational crisis. So the crisis he got through became apparent in his furtive desire to give up athletics, and the relegations experience, which happened in different contexts, workout, championships, moments shared with his friends, led him to an awareness of all the sacrifices he made in order to achieve his vocation, as you can see on the slide. So, among other things, what he says is that he realized that some of the difficulties he encountered were particularly due to the strong level of symbolic imprisonment which goes hand in hand with his sportive accomplishment. And it's interesting to notice that this symbolic imprisonment is often not perceived by athletes, but in moments of crisis, this symbolic imprisonment can come to conscious. So finally, during this 3 years chain of injuries, the achievement of the sportive career was characterized by a weak return on investment, and this durable context led him to question the enchanted vision he had built about the sportive career during the prime inculcation of his vocation, his feeling that sport was a vocation. And the consciousness of the sacrifices he made reveals his switch over in a form of involvement less impassionate, more rational, and more deliberated, which has nothing to do with the first motors of his involvement. Conversely, for other athletes, and I will take the case of François to illustrate this, for other athletes, a long-term experience of injury can offer an occasion to reactivate certain marks of election, so that the feeling that sport is a vocation can be upheld. François gives an illustration of this process While he was under 18, he won the World Youth Championship, and a couple of weeks later, he also reached the gold in an European Championship, the European Championship of the under 20 Junior Championship. So he was considered as a young prodigy and garnered many signs of recognitions. And as we can see in this extract of interview, the effects of the consecration processes he received are still present 6 years later. He still reminds of those moments with a lot of emotion. What happened to him is that when he was 19, he broke his wrist, and the year after he had a stress fracture. So he got out of 3-year chain of injuries, and it took him 4 years to recover his initial level of performances. What stands out of his case is that his family and social supports perceived as a resource by him, but which also constitute a kind of social pressure to maintain his involvement, whatever the cost is, illustrate the strength of the faith in the sportive destiny, which are produced in very homogeneous and enveloping social spheres. The fulfillment of François' sportive destiny falls within a family history, and he likes to joke about this, saying that he probably started to practice athletics when he was in his mother's round, when his mother was pregnant. His father is a coach and an ex-athlete. His mother is a sports executive in his club and is also an ex-athlete. His older sister, as well as his girlfriend, who will become his wife a few years later, are top-level athletes. His little brother is an athlete and will also become a top-level athlete. His main friend also practiced track and field. His case highlights the role of family and close circle who can participate in the symbolic imprisonment process, which goes together with the development and the upholding of a high-level sportive vocation. As I said before, François' sportive and extra-sportive socialization spheres and processes are particularly homogeneous, overlapping and enveloping. So while he faced up the doubt generated during his chain of injuries, all his nearest and dearest got mobilized in order to reactivate his sense of duty to live up. So finally, this social configuration contributed to the uphold of the feeling that sport was his vocation, and contributed to mitigate the lack of institutional recognition due to the regression of sportive performances. So this social configuration undermines the fact that beside the institutional forms of recognition of the gift, some informal modalities of recognition are as powerful to stimulate the involvement and to produce the faith in the top-level destiny and to favor the construction of a high-level athlete's habitus. Furthermore, like other athletes who overpassed their crisis, François retrospectively considered that injury has some positive virtues. He presents his injury as a hardship which hardened him, saying, "What does not kill you makes you stronger." And we shall notice that in certain cases, injury can play the same probative function that Émile Durkheim's negative right in the religious asceticism. In other words, what I mean, and it was shown by a French author who worked on soccer, is that overpassing training pains can constitute a hardship for the access to a top-level career, as suffering constitutes a hardship for the access to the sacred. Thus, in a context of pain and injury, the athlete's resistance and the strength of the feeling that sport is a vocation can be reinforced by the consolidation of ascetic dispositions. So to conclude, up to now, injuries in top-level sports have been essentially studied in reference to the tension generated by paradoxical injunctions. For example, the tensions between the professional field wavering between preservation and exploitation of the bodily capital, or also paradoxical injunction because of an habitus which would be improperly adjusted because of some dissonance between primary and secondary socialization. As in high-level sportive career, you must both know how to use your body, but also you must push how to protect your body, but you must also know how to push your body over some lines which are sometimes which can generate pain, injuries, and so on. So adopting a complementary point of view, my point of view is to pave the way for reflection on another aspect of the issue, which is what is the impact of the different socialization contexts, both in sports and outside of sports, on the potential crisis which might occur during this time of injury and recovery. And more broadly, what I can say is that during the time of injury and recovery, the preservation of the feeling that sport is a vocation requires two main things which can be promoted in different contexts, sportive contexts, in medical institutions too, but also out of sport in family and friend context. So the two main things are a symbolic imprisonment process. The idea is that it's important that there is a continuity between context of before and after the injury, with the maintaining of the symbolic imprisonment process. And also, the context must promote the reactivation of the sign of being elected, as the process of sportive consecration is damaged by the injury. Thank you.
Thank you very much.